All set? Okay.
All set.
All set. All right. Well, when I was looking at the Erie Canal and the bicentennial this year and all the excitement, and I thought, well, we know about the canal. We know it was built through here. It's been here forever as far as we're concerned. But I never heard any stories told first person about the canal, about living near it or being on it or something like that. So I decided to kind of look at it in that way, and found some quotations about the canal and about working with the canal or going on the canal. And I thought maybe that's the angle we would take today, rather than why it was constructed, who was involved, and all that, which we've been over 100 times. The growth of the canal was the reason Albion prospered. Nehemiah Ingersoll, before the canal was dug, apparently had some inside info and came down what we know as Route 98 and kind of had an idea where the canal would go through, and he bought up a lot of land around Albion to speculate on that growth. That's why we have Ingersoll Street, Nehemiah Ingersoll. And it was because of his vision that promoted Albion as a port, in quotes, on the canal. The original Erie Canal, built in 1825, was 4 feet deep. Not very deep. 40 feet wide, and with locks that were 90 feet long. There were a total of 83 locks on the canal when it opened in 1825. So you went through a lock and went a little ways, and went through another lock and went a little ways, which is different than we look at the Erie Canal. We don't see that locks until you get to Lockport, right? And then you see a lot of locks. Albion, then known as Newport on the Erie Canal, began to develop rapidly after entrepreneur purchased land, which is Nehemiah Ingersoll, near the intersection of the canal and the main road, which we call Main Street. So that intersection, they thought, this is going to be a place, maybe I should buy the land and then resell it. The canal played a crucial role in Albion in shaping its economy. And also, they did list Lafayette's visit on the Erie Canal, and we have a marker down by the canal of Lafayette being here. The canal, in 1836, Thomas Woodcock made a trip from Schenectady, New York, to Buffalo and recorded his experience on a packet ship. These boats are about 70 feet long, and with the exception of the kitchen and bar, is occupied as a cabin. The forward part, being the ladies' cabin, is separated by a curtain, but at mealtimes this obstruction is removed and the table is set the whole length of the boat. The table is supplied with everything that is necessary and of the best quality, with many of the luxuries of life. On finding we had so many passengers, I was at a loss to know how we should be accommodating them with berths, as I saw no convenience for anything of the kind. But the Yankees, ever awake to contrivances, have managed to stow more in so small a space than I thought capable of doing. So let's hear it for the Yankees. The way they proceed is as follows. The settees that go the whole length of the boat on each side unfold and form a cot bed. The space between this bed and the ceiling is so divided as to make room for 2 more. The upper berths are merely frames with sacking bottoms, on one side of which has 2 projecting pins which fit into sockets in the side of the boat. So they're supported in the side of the boat. The other side has 2 cords attached, one to each corner. These are suspended from hooks in the ceiling. The bedding is then placed upon them, the space between the berths being barely sufficient for a man to crawl in, and presenting the appearance of so many shelves. Much apprehension is always entertained by passengers when first seeing them, lest the cords should break. Such fears, however, are groundless. The berths are allotted according to the way the bill, the first on the list having first choice, and in changing boats, the old passengers have the preference. The first night I tried an upper berth, but the air was so foul that I found myself sick when I awoke. Oh, sounds like fun. Afterwards, I chose an under berth and found no ill effects from the air. These boats have 3 horses, go at a quicker rate, and have the preference in going through the locks, carry no freight, are built extremely light, and have quite genteel men for their captains, and use silver plate. The distance between Schenectady and Utica is 80 miles. The passage is $3.50, equivalent to our $69 today, which includes board. There are other boats called line boats that carry at a cheaper rate, being found for 2/3 of the price mentioned. They are larger boats, carry freight, and have only 2 horses, and consequently do not go as quickly, and moreover have not so select a company. Some boats go as low as 1 cent per mile. So you got your choice of how you want to travel on the canal. The bridges on the canal are very low, particularly the old ones. Indeed, they are so low as to scarcely allow the baggage to clear, and in some cases actually rubbing against it. Every bridge makes us bend double if seated on anything, and in many cases you have to lie on your back. The man at the helm gives the word to the passengers, bridge, very low bridge, the lowest in the canal, as the case may be. Some serious injuries have happened for want of caution. A young English woman met with her death a short time since, she having fallen asleep with her head upon a box, and her head was crushed to pieces. Such things, however, do not often occur, and in general it affords amusement to the passengers, who soon imitate the cry and vary it with a command, such as, all Jackson men bow down. After such commands, we find few aristocrats on these boats.
About what year was it, Dee?
Pardon me?
Did you tell us what year that was, or around when you?
Yeah, around, I think it was 1836. Yep. Low bridges, as I mentioned before, over the canal, they were low, requiring passengers to duck or bridge. They'd yell bridge and everybody would have to get down. Packet boats, small boats called packet boats, carried passengers and goods, often carrying up to 60 people. That's a lot of people in one boat, plus the crew. The Erie Canal was the first non-bridge chosen as an ASCE National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. Because of the Erie Canal, they learned so much about engineering, and it was before dynamite. So if they had to blow something to get through, they used black powder and set fire to black powder because there was no dynamite. So it was an engineering marvel at the time that this canal could be dug 40 feet deep. I mean, that's pretty amazing. The canal encouraged westward expansion, helping people to move to the Midwest and connected economies. The popular song, Low Bridge Everybody Down, is associated with the Erie Canal and the low bridges. Clinton's Ditch, the Erie Canal, was nicknamed Clinton's Ditch because the governor had okayed it, because it had been suggested before, and they went, no, you're never going to do something like that. Dig a hole across New York State now. Well, Governor Clinton decided he would okay it, and that's why it's called Clinton's Ditch. The canal project is credited with providing practical schooling for early American civil engineers and leading to the founding of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So because the canal was dug, that school came into existence. Some freedom seekers used the Erie Canal as part of the Underground Railroad and escaped to Canada. The peak traffic for the canal was 1855. Today, the canal is a popular destination for recreational boating and New York Canalway Trail. The start of the construction was 1817 in Rome, New York. The grand opening was 1825. The length from Albany to Buffalo is 363 miles. The number of locks in 1825 was 83. Number of locks today is 57. So we're kind of shrinking it down. The elevation, Albany to Buffalo, was 571 feet. The Erie Canal was built with raw labor and amateur engineering. It was kind of the school for engineering at the time, because they confronted all kinds of problems that hadn't been thought of to try to dig a ditch from one side of New York to the other. In 1809, when President Thomas Jefferson reviewed New York's plans for a canal, he dismissed it as little short of madness and refused to authorize federal fundings. Less than a decade later, when New York's political savvy DeWitt Clinton pushed the controversial canal plan, his opponents mocked the project as DeWitt's ditch or Clinton's folly. So there weren't a whole lot of people that thought it was a smart idea. In 1825, just 8 years after the workers broke ground, DeWitt boarded a barge called the Seneca Chief and took a victory cruise along the newly opened Erie Canal. It's estimated to dig the Erie Canal took 50,000 men. That's a lot of citizens, 50,000 men. Dug by hand. Yeah, this was before mechanized anything. So it was all literally manpower that dug the canal. They tried to hire European engineers, but they were too busy, too expensive, or didn't want any part of that audacious scheme to cut through what was wilderness at the time and get from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. The engineers thought, this is crazy, I'm not getting involved in this. But to hire an amateur crew of self-taught local engineers that included a few inexperienced surveyors and at least one local math teacher, the two chief engineers are Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, lawyers by trade who learned how to survey by prosecuting land disputes. So because they had to deal with these in court, they self-taught about the canal. Lock construction, as well as aqueducts, required something called hydraulic cement. That hydraulic cement is similar to what they used to build cobblestone houses around here. It was something that was discovered. They used it on the canal, and later you're going to find, or around the time of the canal, they find the cement. They used it for cobblestone houses around here. At first, the contractors mostly hired local farmers and homesteaders who were eager to get this new waterway completed and have ready access to lucrative markets up and down the canal. Wages were 50 cents to $1 a day. From 1818 to 1819, around 3,000 men and 700 horses labored every day to dig the section of the Erie Canal from Utica to the Seneca River. A lot of manpower, a lot of time, no machines. So all physical labor. Irish immigrant labor gradually overtook local workers, and anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment swelled along the canal construction. The Irish workers were often paid in whiskey, in addition to their meager wages of $12 a month. Don't make fun of the Irish. They've had enough. And also in the Catholics. The Catholics were looked down upon too. I have a German Lutheran grandmother who says about her neighbors, she's Catholic, but she's nice. I will never forget that until the day I die. I was in college and my grandparents had moved from the farm down by Lake Erie. And their house was on this side of the road and the neighbor's house was over there. And Grandma was friends with her. She said, on the way over, we're walking over to the lady's house. And I don't even remember who the lady was. Because across the road, Grandma says, she's Catholic, but she's nice. So you got to know what's going on. In fact, one of our twins just became a Catholic. I'm glad Grandma isn't around anymore. Tools used on the Erie Canal. Laborers had nothing more than axes, pickaxes, shovels to fell countless trees and uproot giant stumps. The first was a crank-driven tree feller adapted from the European design. An implement called a plow and scraper was pulled through the earth by draft horses to break up small roots and loosen tough clay. Another device called a slip scraper functioned like a modern-day bulldozer or bucket loader, scraping up rubble and dumping it into debris pits. Jeremiah Brainerd, who made a small fortune selling his patented Brainerd's Barrow to workers frustrated with the old style of wheelbarrow that was a box shape with vertical sides. Brainerd's design had a rounded basin that made it far easier to dump out the wheelbarrow's contents with one good heave. So even wheelbarrows were improved because of the Erie Canal. The canal engineers had to figure out how to overcome 70-foot change in elevation. The average lock on the canal could only lift between 10 to 15 feet. There was a competition to come up with the best solution, and Nathan Roberts, a former school teacher, came up with the winning idea: a staircase of 5 consecutive locks, each stacked on top of the other. The flight of locks was so successful that the nearby town was named Lockport. So now we see where Lockport got its name. The Irish got a bad reputation in Lockport, but after the so-called deep cut through the rock was completed, many of the Irish workers settled in Lockport and established a proudly Irish outpost in upstate New York. In 1834, the canal underwent a major enlargement, 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep, to better handle an increased crush of boat traffic. So the traffic was increasing and they enlarged it. And I think it was interesting to find things here in Orleans County that are kind of unique to the canal. The canal loop, it's easy to miss in Holly, New York. So there was a loop in the canal in Holly, New York, and you could go and see the marker and so on. The state veered the canal from a relatively straight line in 1823 due to the high banks and engineering challenge in dealing with Sandy Creek. There was an unusually deep ravine formed by the east branch of Sandy Creek, which represented a difficult engineering problem for builders of the original Erie Canal. Rather than try to build the canal on the ravine, engineers opted to take a sharp turn near the current lift bridge and cross over a relatively narrow section of creek. The sharp curve required boaters to slow down, which made a promising location for canal-orientated businesses. So they had to slow down. So let's get them for food or for clothing, and that's how Holly developed. The village of Holly grew at this bend in the canal. The Erie Canal was built to overcome specific topographical challenges during the construction of the Erie Canal. That invention was the culvert in Medina. It was enabled the road to pass under the canal in a more economical and efficient manner than building a bridge. So the culvert in Medina is also unique to the canal in Orleans County, in anywhere. The Medina culvert, it's originally constructed in 1823, was designed as a cost-effective alternative to a bridge across the growing canal. It remains the only place on the entire canal system where vehicles and pedestrians can pass under the canal. It was reinforced in 1906 to accommodate the wider canal during the enlargement period. So they didn't get rid of it when they enlarged the canal. They just made it better, which is a logical thing to do as far as I'm concerned. It remains the only place on the entire canal where vehicles and pedestrians can pass underneath the canal. Sidewalks on both sides allow for walking under the waterway. So we have some unique things because of the Erie Canal, and we have them here in Orleans County. The next few things I want to read to you. It is the diary of a young girl, the Erie Canal in 1822, which I thought was rather unique. It's under Rochester history. It has 2 volumes, and they don't know what the girl's name was that wrote the diary, but she traveled on the Erie Canal. And I'll read you a quote. As we advanced, the country became more cultivated and the roads better. Lodged at Ridgeway, a miserable, dirty tavern, where we placed in a large room used by Freemasons in their meetings and ornamented with insignia of their order. We burnt a dim light in the chimney, which added to the effect and gave it the appearance of a haunted chamber. All the romances I have ever read passed through my mind, so that from the novelty of our situation, together with the various disagreeables with which the place abounded in the form of rats, mice, bats, and so on, we passed in all a most miserable night and rose without regret at 3 a.m. to take the stage to Rochester. Reached Gaines, a village 17 miles from Ridgeway, for breakfast. Passed Sandy Creek and Charleston in considerable places and arrived in Rochester at noon. So her experience in Orleans County was not the best. But I think it's interesting to hear from first-hand accounts. Apparently she was used to more luxurious than what we offered in Ridgeway. Adam Beitelman said, in March 1822, I helped the contractor who had taken a section of canal to dig where Medina now stands and build a log cabin. We cut our trees from the building on the ground, now the site of the village. We finished our cabin in 5.5 days. I then engaged to work for the contractor half a month for $6.50 and be boarded. Our work was digging for the canal. The first 2 days we had 15 and the third day about 50. We were allowed a liquor ration. Mr. Eggleston, the contractor, brought in on ox cart from Rochester 3 barrels of whiskey among other stores to use on his job. Of this, each man was allowed 1 gill a day. At this time, I was unacquainted with the nature of whiskey, and I, with the others, drank my first allowance. I will not here attempt to describe its effects. Suffice it to say, it was the first and last liquor ration I ever drank. I sold the remainder of my whiskey rations to those who were familiar with their use at 3 cents each. So he made a little money. Horatio Hughes settled in Shelby in 1825 as a partner in business with LAGB Grant. He was engaged in selling goods, running mills, and dealing in produce with Mr. Grant for some years, and after that became a large contractor to do public work and had large jobs of work on the Erie Canal. He moved to Medina to reside about the year 1854, where he died in 1862. He was an energetic businessman who was extensively known in this part of the state. He married a daughter of Colonel A.A. Ellicott. I thought this was interesting. This is Lansing Bailey. He was an early settler. In the summer of, this is his quote. In the summer of 1816, I heard a man's voice hollering in the woods south of my house. I went to see what was going on, saw several men there, and inquired what they were about. One of them said they were going to make us a canal. I laughed at them and told them they would hardly make water run uphill between here and Albany. I added it would be as long as I would ask to live to be able to see such a canal as they talked of in operation. How little did I know then of what men could perform, aided by intellectual culture and public wealth, having up to that time spent most of my life in the woods. Before this, we had to go to Batavia for our merchant's goods and to the post office. So he was here before there was anything here. And this was his remembrances in 1861. Asa Sanford said, "The canal now being open, farmers found a ready market and better prices for their produce. Home manufacturers were protected from foreign competition and the price of domestic goods greatly reduced. It was then the farmers began to thrive and soon to pay up for their lands. The price of real estate advanced, and some even predicted the time would come when the best farms would be worth $100 per acre, hardly expecting to live to see them predictions fulfilled as they have done so far." This is Linus Jones Peck in 1864. "I left the town where I was born in 1817 and arrived in Clarendon, or what is now Clarendon, Orleans County, just 40 years ago today, 1864. I came to Holly first in the spring of 1856 and stayed until December. I then returned to Pendleton in Niagara County and completed a large job I had on the Erie Canal through the mountain ridge and went back to Holly in 1857, since which time I have been its resident." Harvey Goodrich was born in Herkimer County, November 1791. His father, Zenas Goodrich, removed to that place from Berkshire, Massachusetts. When a young man, Harvey Goodrich removed to Auburn, New York, and worked for some time at the business of making hats, and for several years he officiated as constable. Having been successful in accumulating property, he and his brother-in-law, George Standard, took a job of work in making the Erie Canal, and leaving Auburn after his canal work was completed, he located permanently at Albion in the year 1824 and engaged in selling dry goods and groceries in company with George Standard.
I think his shop was on Beaver Hill.
Yeah, could well have been, because it was near the canal. Yeah. Yep. And Avery Starkweather. Avery M. Starkweather was born in Preston, Connecticut, October 3rd, 1790. He resided a time in Palmyra, New York, and came to the town of Erie and took an article for his farm, April 1816. After the Erie Canal was open for 13 years, he had charge of the first state repairing scow boat on this section. He was superintendent of canal repairs one year. His beat extended from Holly to Lockport, and his salary was $500, without a clerk or any prerequisites. His instructions required him to travel over and personally inspect his section at least once a week in the season of navigation, which he did. For 13 years, he was an assessor of the town of Erie and was supervisor of the town for the years 1842 and 43. He was active, thorough businessman, honest and conscientious, much respected as far as he was known. He died October 3rd, 1865. So, Starkweathers were here too. Mr. Israel Root, father of Amos, was a soldier in the Revolution, removed from Allegheny to Orleans County in 1825, and settled on a farm now owned by his son Amos in Berry. He came across the country in a wagon with his family, and Amos brought the goods on 2 canoes made out of pine logs and lashed together. These he launched on the Genesee River at Gardow and paddled down to Rochester, and then put them in the canal and came to Gaines Basin, then a favorite landing place for immigrants who come by canal to settle in this vicinity. So the word was out. Get on the canal, get to a place they call Albion, Newport, and you could start a business. This is Zenas Hibbard. I attended the first school taught in Barry in a log schoolhouse, which stood on the west side of Oak Orchard Road in what is now the village of Albion. I also attended the first town meeting in Barry after the town was organized at the house of Abram Madison, about 2 miles south of Albion. I also attended the great celebration of the opening of the Erie Canal when the waters of Lake Erie mingled with those of the Hudson River. I was also present when the site for the county buildings was located at Albion, which was the most exciting time perhaps ever known in this county. I was present when the first congregational church in the town of Barry was formed at the house of Joseph Hart. This church then consisted of the following named persons: Joseph Hart and wife, Ebenezer Rogers and wife, Ithmar Hibbard and wife, Artemis Thayer and wife, Artemis Hooten, and Thankful Thurston. This was written in 1865.
I live in the Joseph Hart house. 1820.
Yep.
Me too.
You do. She didn't mention it, did she? It's her house. Not possessing at my father's the advantage for mental improvement which I desired, I concluded in the fall of 1825 to abandon my pioneer life, return to the East, obtain an education, and study a profession. This is Benjamin Bessick. Accordingly, October 2nd, 1825, I left my axe and handpick and went to Lockport, got on board the canal boat DeWitt Clinton, and sailed for the East. Stopping in Albion for the boat to take on loading, I took an excursion through that low, muddy, and as I thought, unsightly young village. I little, though, then that Newport, as it was called, was destined to be my future home. I then pronounced Newport a queer place on which to build a town. But he came back. That was Bessick.
Was that from Pioneer History?
It was something he wrote in January 8th, 1862. So,
because the DeWitt Clinton was a tugboat that was built.
Yes.
Later, though.
It was later, yeah. Roswell Burroughs, in November 1824, his younger brother Lorenzo Burroughs came to Albion to assist him as his clerk. This arrangement continued until 1826. The firm of R.S. and L. Burroughs was formed, which existed in business as dry goods merchants, produce dealers, and in warehousing and forwarding on the Erie Canal for 10 or 11 years, when they sold out their entire stock of goods. When Mr. Burroughs settled in Albion, the canal was made navigable as far west as Lockport, and one inducement he had to stop here was the promise of the canal commissioner, William C. Bout, that he should receive the appointment of collector of canal revenue, an office then about to be established in Albion. The office of collector was given to him in 1825 and was continued by reappointment until 1832, when he was succeeded by C.S. McConnell. So people got their jobs, too, by coming here and knowing that there was a place needed for them. I think some of these, Nehemiah Ingersoll, he was the man who really pushed to get the land. He and his ancestors built the large warehouse standing on the canal at the foot of Platt Street and a frame building for a store on the corner of Main and Canal Streets, where the Empire Block now stands. Justice Ingersoll, his brother, after the canal was made navigable and Medina began to be settled as a village, he removed there, built a large tannery, and transferred his business to that place. He was appointed Indian agent and postmaster at Medina by President Jackson. He was also judge of Orleans County Courts, his tannery being accidentally burned and sustaining other misfortunes in business. He removed to Detroit with his brother Nehemiah in 1835. So the Ingersolls were here for about 10 years. There are other ones, but I won't test your patience today. I think this is interesting. This was told by Mrs. Ross Arnett, who was here from 1884 to 1905. She writes about being on the Erie Canal. The canal on which my father had his boats was 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep. When the canal was first built, it was only 45 feet wide and 12 feet deep. Today it is 125 feet wide and 12 feet deep. There were three kinds of boats traveling on the canal. They were known as bullheads, lakers, and scows. On the bullheads and lakers, the cabins were flush with the deck, but cabins on the scows rose several feet above the deck. So the layout was different. On this deck, there was an awning supported by poles, and between two poles was swung a hammock. This was my playroom on pleasant days. My mother, ever concerned for my safety, tied me with a rope to a ring which was in the center of the deck. When we came to a bridge which was neither swing nor lift, the drivers would call out, "Low bridge!" The steermen and everyone else would duck. Mother would run up the steps, untie me, and carry me to safety. So, and this is the sketch that she drew of the boat that she grew up on. One day, Mother forgot that I was on the deck. The man called, "Low bridge." And when several minutes later Mother remembered me, she had just time to grab a butcher knife, run up the steps, cut the rope, and snatch me to safety as the scow swung under the low bridge. Mama got her just in time. The father's pair of scows would be loaded with wheat at Buffalo and proceed down the canal to Troy, drawn by a span of mules. In the stern of the boat there was a stable in which were kept 2 extra teams of mules. The boats traveled 24 hours a day. A shift of teamsters and mules was made every 6 hours. So you can see how they eventually had to organize. The trip to Troy from Buffalo was about 340 miles. We covered about 3 miles an hour. The entire trip took from a week to 10 days. Steermen were at the wheel constantly. The wheel controlled the tiller at the back of the scow, which directed its course. The mules traveled on the north side or the bank. This was known as the tow path. There was another narrower path on the opposite bank, was called the heel path. Father's 2 scows were about 1/3 the size of the present-day barge. They were fastened together, one behind the other. It was a temptation to jump from the first, on which we lived, to the second. Strict discipline and tragic stories of what happened to little ones who tried to jump kept my brother and me from such an adventure. However, my brother did fall into the water one day. It was during a rainstorm and the deck was quite slippery. If he went yellow slicker, boots and all, he was followed into the water by one of my father's loyal steermen, who soon had him safe, and Mother soon had him dry again. The bridge which led up from the stable in the hole to the bank was narrow, steep, and often slippery. Mules were ordinarily sure-footed, but sometimes they didn't negotiate the trip. There was no way to save them once they were in the canal. I remember that the sight of dead mules floating in the canal was not too rare a sight. That, not something that I've imagined. But you can see, how would they get them out? Could they step on? There was no way to get them out if they fell in. Of course, it was inevitable that 2 scows going in the opposite direction would meet. In order for these scows to pass, the boat on the side farther away from the towpath would have to let down the rope or hawse it slack, enough for the near boat to pass over the rope. It was always a tense time, for sometimes the passing boat caught the tow rope and tore it loose. This was serious and was bound to bring recriminations from the injured boatsman. Without delay, the rope was spliced and the boat was on its way again. So there were hard times when you were on the canal. You had to know what you were doing. You just didn't get in the boat and go down the canal. You had to know what to do if you met one on the canal. Days passed pleasantly and without much excitement for a preschool child. One of the pleasant breaks in routine came when the scows arrived at one of the regular canal stores. Here, Mother would stock up on supplies that she needed to serve 12 to 14 people 3 meals a day. Meals were served at 2 sittings. Steersmen and drivers were at the first table. The family was served at the second table. First table was served at 6, noon, and 6. Mother had quite a reputation as a cook. She enjoyed baking for the men and often served the drivers special pies. The men loved her pies. Father would joke with them, telling them that too much pie would make them have sore feet. The drivers walked miles every day behind the mules. Their feet were always tender and sore, so Father's teasing didn't bother them. When we arrived at Albany, we joined other scows to continue the trip to the Hudson. Scows lined up 9 boats wide and 10 boats long. In this formation, 2 side wheelers would tow the boats down the Hudson to New York City. This part of the trip stands out as a highlight. It was breathtakingly beautiful. The lovely forest-covered Palisades seemed to be closing in on either side. There were joyful times when we approached villages or cities and little bumboats brought out to the scows candy, ice cream, bread, and other staples and luxuries. They were little boat stores and they were fascinating to little boys and girls. Sure, the ice cream and the cookies and the candy is coming. On about the 3rd morning, we arrived at the harbor of the city. Tugboats joined us here and towed the scows to slips and piers where great liners waited to take our cargo of grain and reload the scows for the return trip. We were in the harbor about a week before beginning the return trip. Most of that time was spent on shore, and we children had happy times. The water in the harbors always churned angrily because of the great activity of the boats. This made Mother quite seasick, and she was always glad to take us ashore. We shopped, saw shows, and went to Coney Island. Many pleasant hours were spent visiting the parks and the great liners. When Father had finished business transactions and the scows were loaded for the return trip, we were towed back to the Hudson. There the trip began in reverse. We were on the scows from about April 1st to December 1st. During the winter, the boats were tied and dry docked. Father's boats were named Jessie Oderkirk and Joseph Brandt. So I thought that was interesting to have a first-hand account of her family's involvement with the canal. Anybody have any questions?
I always heard that that's why there's like 8 miles between towns. That's as far as the mules would go.
Oh, well, there could be something. I haven't found that, but that doesn't mean it's not so.
And if you travel, you will notice that each town is about 8 miles in between each town.
That could be. I hadn't, like I said, I hadn't come across it, but it sounds logical in that day and age when you had physically dug that place, no equipment, and you were sailing your boat from here to New York City. Yes, you would have had to stop for supplies. You would have had to sell some things to get enough money to go farther. It's logical that there would be.
And I know in Monroe County there's a section called Wide Waters where they said boats would go in so other boats would go out.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of similar to Medina Basin, where it's wider.
And before Medina, past Knowlesville?
Knowlesville,
There's
yeah.
also a big white water. Yeah, before, yeah.
Yeah. So there's,
Street, right.
yeah. And that's why I was interested in these stories, because these are things you don't hear about when you just hear, well, they dug the canal and they, all the technical things that we've all heard forever and ever, and wasn't even born here. But I've heard it over and over again. And I thought it was interesting to hear some firsthand accounts.
One of my first experiences was to find out that they drained the canal.
Did they drain the canal?
Yeah, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Well, it's like the story when I did on the Norwegian settlement. The Norwegians came over in a ship from Norway. The leader of them stayed in New York City to sell the boat while they all went down the canal and ended up in Kendall for the Norwegian settlement. He left New York City after the canal was drained. So they said he bought a pair of skates, and he skated on the ice on the canal from New York City to Holly. And yeah, and some of my kids say, "Ma, he wouldn't have skated that far. And what if it snowed?" I said, "Well, then he had snowshoes." Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
My father used to skate on the canal.
Did he?
Yeah, and he had his jacket. He lived in Spencerport at the time.
Uh-huh.
And if the wind was just right, it would.
You use like a boat. You'd be like a boat where you can hold your sail.
And I skated down the canal for an hour, and then we found out that it's not always the safest thing.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you for coming. Appreciate it.